Hello and welcome to Mind the Gap, Building an AI-Ready Government. My name's Gavin Heaton and I'm here from Disruptors Co. And I'm joined by Joanne Jacobs, my co-CEO and Public Purpose Proprietary Limited and all-round smart, excellent, amazing consultant at government and public service levels, Martin Stewart Weeks. Thanks for joining me, folks. And if you have questions through this, we'll just take those questions straight through LinkedIn Live. Just drop a message into our comments and we'll see you there. And we'll grab those questions and bring them to the panel as we go. But right now, I'll just have Joanne introduce herself and then Martin introduce himself as well. Over to you, Jo.
Thanks, Gavin. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Joanne Jacobs. I have a background in academia before being a consultant here in Australia and overseas, running word-of-mouth marketing firms and doing facilitation work and in innovation. And I'm here in Sydney today as part of the CSIRO's On Prime program for their showcase this afternoon. So if you've got a chance to come across to Sydney to Savo and have a look at that in Chifley Square, I'm going to encourage you to attend.
Cool. Martin.
Yeah, well, that sounds good. The wind has stopped blowing, so you can get into Sydney now. So go ahead and come. It's safe. It's safe again. Hi, Martin Stewart Weeks. Very good to see you and be here with this conversation. I'm also based in Sydney. I'm here on Gadigal land, actually, part of the Eora Nation. So I'll pay my respects to my local Aboriginal owners, past, present, and rising. So down here on the eastern suburbs. Kind of number of hats, a consulting hat and advisory hat for some time now, under the moniker of public purpose. Spent a bit of time in government some time ago, but federal and state, a chunk of time with Cisco. So kind of paddling around in the wonderful world of networking, the internet back in the early 2000s. And then more recently, just quickly sort of updating the last couple of years, I've been a practice fellow with the Australian-New Zealand School of Government, where I've been spending a lot of my time actually thinking about the very things we're talking about today, which is how in government are we going to engage this new world that is increasingly being defined by AI at the moment, but by obviously now a long period of digital change and digital transformation. So a very timely conversation. It's great to be part of it.
And it feels certainly like the pace is accelerating around AI, not sort of letting up anytime soon. I'm sure you're both sort of seeing this on all stages. Of course, one of the challenges with that is making sure that our public sector is ready and able to face these challenges head on and to have some kind of coordinated response to that. And hopefully that's some of the things we'll be discussing this afternoon. So I'd like to start first of all around this theme of skills gaps and capability building. And what does skills in the public service need to look like? What do we need to do to prepare and govern AI confidently at the public service level? So Martin, what do you think some of these biggest capability gaps actually are?
Yeah, it's a good point. And as I was explaining to you guys a little earlier, I've just spent the last couple of days actually in our national capital talking about this very topic, the skills thing, but in the context of a conference, a 2-day conference, which was fascinating around AI in government. And yeah, not surprisingly, this issue came up because I suppose there's a kind of interesting conundrum about whether the technology is ready, but rather more importantly, whether the organizations are ready for the technology and what is that sense of readiness. And the answer I think I got yesterday in particular over the last couple of days, and it's my own reflection, is sort of yes, but only in parts. It's very patchy. But I think the skills gap needs to be broken down a bit because at one level, the risk is if you have a conversation with folks in government about skills, they think, what that means is I've got to become a better prompter. Someone's got to teach me about writing good prompts. In other words, the default reflection often is skills in a technical sense. And yes, that's important. You do have to have some facility to press, roughly speaking, the right button at the right time. Absolutely. Come back to that perhaps. It seems to me, though, that there are two other substantive domains that I think the public sector is grappling with. Excuse me. One of them is, I guess I'd call it broadly a governance and leadership piece. The truth is that in particular with AI, of course, in the last couple of years, But I think this has been true for quite some time in the sort of various ups and downs of the digital transformation journey, so far as I've tracked it anyway, in the last 25 years. I think this transformation has always challenged the public service about the role of leaders and what they're supposed to do in this space, both in terms of their own technical skills, but how they hold the right kind of space to allow their teams and their people to get the best out of these new affordances, as it were, that the technology world is throwing at them. And then there's a very strong governance piece. There was a lot of conversation in the last 2 days from a lot of very, very skilled experts who came to have a yarn about the need to get the governance piece right. And if you do not get that right, if you haven't got those skills, if you just are relying on sort of traditional and inherited notions of what governance is, you're going to be in trouble. And then I think the other piece is a cultural piece that always comes up. It's been true about the technology revolution in government for ages. You know, people always say, oh, it's not about the technology, it's all about culture. Well, actually, it is about the technology. But by heavens, it's very, very substantially challenging at a cultural level as well. So I think the skills piece can break down, you know, technical, leadership, governance, culture. And yes, the answer is massive uplift required. What I'm seeing, interested to see if other people are having the same experience, and put it on the chat maybe or in the comments, it'd be interesting to see. It's very patchy, is perhaps the most polite way I could put it. And I think that's a problem, because it needs to be much more consistent, it needs to be much higher, and it needs to go much quicker, is roughly, I think, the summary I'd leave you with at the moment.
That sounds about right. Jo, are you seeing something similar in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, Australia is, generally speaking, falling behind, and that's kind of unusual for Australia, because we've generally been a nation of neophiliacs. We've loved the idea of adopting new tools, and in truth, we have been adopting AI. I mean, depends on which report you read, but between 60 and 70% of all companies are now using AI with no guardrails, and that's kind of frightening on many levels. But if we're talking about use of AI in government in particular, there's evidence that people in government are just saying, no, let's not do anything at all with AI, let's ban it, rather than actually use it in any way, shape or form, because rightly so, they're concerned about ethical use of AI, responsible use of AI, and ensuring people's privacy, etc. However, I mean, it's perfectly reasonable concern, but actually saying let's not use it at all is not just putting Australia in a lagging position, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we are lagging the world when it comes to use of AI. But this is the big difference between, I think, AI and almost every other technological revolution. There has been adoption of AI. There's been a process of change management. You adopt a tool, you adopt a set of resources, and as Martin says, you adopt a culture, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then you keep using it for a while. Okay, so there's kind of like, this has been done. We have done the cutover to this new piece of technology. But that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. Yeah. It's just constantly changing. So it's a different kind of change management process. And I feel like government in Australia is treating it like a changeover to a new operating system.
Operating model. Yeah, it's a great point. Can I just, Gavin, just riff off a couple more observations? Again, slightly fired up by the last 48 hours of my life down there in Canberra. Two observations, and you guys would know this as well as me, and others on the call may also have plugged into this information. At a kind of whole of society level, we're not actually buying into this game at all. We're very frightened of it, or we're bored, or we're not interested. But we're actually, on all the scales I've seen of countries that are showing a sort of broad national response, you know, yes, we think it's exciting and blah. We are literally at the rock bottom of all of those charts that I've seen. So there's something going on here at quite a deep, visceral, national, cultural level that says we're not actually quite comfortable with this game. It's a trust issue. There's no doubt about that. It's a risk issue. Yeah, get all that. And that brings me to my second point, which is very much what Jo's just said. One of the things that popped up in these last couple of days, but I've been playing around with a fair bit in my own conversations with folks on this, is the relationship between risk and resilience. And we are reaching the stage where all the evidence I'm picking up from practitioners, some theorists, as much reading as I can cram into a day, which is probably more than I should and not enough, all that sort of stuff, suggests to me that this technology in particular, if you deal with the risk factors by prohibition, either self-imposed, you are really going to be in trouble. Because the way you will build up both your confidence and your capability to be more resilient as this stuff keeps churning and changing, every 2.5 hours there's another announcement about the next hurdle. But if your response is, well, I won't even be in the race, you will never get to the level of confidence that builds up the resilience. So handling risk and engaging it, in other words, sitting still doing nothing, is absolutely the riskiest thing you could possibly be doing at the moment, because you're not building up in any sense that sort of anti-fragile capacity to actually not get broken by this wretched stuff. And the problem is, the more you stay away from it, the more you're going to get broken by it. Does that make sense? And I think in
100%.
government, that's a real challenge. That's a real challenge.
We've said this for years, that there's this innovation risk paradox, that the more you avoid risk, the more you create risk. And we are literally, in the boiling ocean of AI risk right now that we need to actually navigate. And I feel like there's this kind of, I think because of a whole series of other factors that are around us right now, including, the global conflict, tariff, anything that's got a Trump associated with it, wars, existential threats from climate change, all of these kinds of things together are kind of masking the fact that we actually need to be embracing, we need to find a way of navigating and embracing these technologies for their best outcomes, rather than necessarily regarding them as a threat.
Yeah, completely.
It's interesting. One of the questions I've got on my list is to talk about, what is the urgency here? And clearly, the challenge for us all is that the ground is shifting so fast and so far. I think 18 months ago we ran a little seminar on how to, well, more than a seminar, but a deep dive into how to use AI prompting to help business. And within 2 weeks of that training exercise, OpenAI released the next version of the model, and it basically made it all obsolete. So we're having to move very, very fast, and we're not even being able to consume and absorb what it is that we're seeing fast enough in order to put it to use.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I know we'll probably get on and talk about this a bit more later. There's always been an interesting dynamic, in my view, about the relationship between the technology world and how it operates, its sort of rhythms, its metabolism, if you like, and government. And to some extent, of course, and so broadly speaking, one is very fast and furious. Broadly speaking, speed and intensity is the name of their game, connectedness, all that good stuff. Government, of course, to some extent is deliberately slow. Sometimes it's unnecessarily slow, but actually quite a lot of the time we want government to be a bit slower, because there are, people's lives at stake and all that kind of stuff. So we sort of want it to be a bit slower, a bit more discerning, a bit more kind of, let's just get our bearings straight here. But that mismatch is becoming very awkward now. I mean, really uncomfortable, I think. And to be fair, and I'm hoping there'll be some folks on this call who might want to put a perspective from within the system, that, to the extent I get a sense of what's happening inside the system in the public service, particularly in senior leaders. I think there's a genuine sense this is a very uncomfortable place to be at the moment, because there's a deep sense that the speed and intensity with which we engage this has got to, we've got to up our metabolism, get all that. And yet there's so many reasons, as I say, some good, some perhaps not so noble, why everything is dragging us in the opposite direction. We want to keep slowing things down, and we can't get going fast enough, and it's all still a bit clunky. Not always the case, but yeah, sorry.
When we all have the same technologies, I mean, we all have access to these technologies. There's no kind of unfair advantage. There's no sort of, there's no barriers. So we all have access to the same technology. Therefore, the expectation of the citizenry is also changing, that we're going to have better efficiencies, that we're going to have more capabilities, that there are going to be tools that are being used to help decision making that mean that we don't make as many errors. I mean, government has generally tried to avoid errors, but it has often made them. So, you know, this is the issue, is that when you have these tools, the expectations are going to be rising. And yes, it's going to be uncomfortable, because actually some of perhaps the reasons why certain decisions were made will not actually be defensible in this modern environment.
In a short period of time, even.
Yeah,
indeed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting that the two-speed kind of challenge is real. I think we're seeing in both the UK and in the US that there's a heavy investment in AI. And I think, Joe, you were mentioning before that UAE is putting a significant amount of investment into AI as well. In the UK, there's £187 million in school programs that are working towards upskilling the next generation. What does that mean for the next generation of public servants? You know, we're seeing the demographic shifts now taking place fairly significantly across all sectors of society, and that will include public service. What do you think we're going to see sort of an uptick in government investment in skilling and governance and all the things and change management and culture and everything we need around that?
Well, I think we're certainly going to see that all of those topics become more talked about, and the agenda will be set. The question is what exactly we'll see. I was interested just today, was it earlier this morning or last night? I'm slightly blurred about that. Interesting announcement from the UK. For some time now, they've had what's the word? An initiative called One Big Thing. And what they've done in the civil service in Westminster is every year they've set a single technology or digital upskilling focus or priority, and then worked very hard to get all of that one issue handled all across the civil service. So lift all boats on that one issue. And this year's issue, not surprisingly, is AI. So here's a civil service, you know, clearly a bigger one than ours, and one that we model ourselves on in so many different ways, basically saying that right this minute in Westminster, the one big thing that they're going for this year is AI. So there's an interesting question to be asked about the way in which an entire public service, and let's stick to the APS as an example in Canberra, because that's where I was, but you know, this could be New South Wales or wherever. To what extent do we need to get ourselves geared up to do that kind of thing? So in other words, to say, let's keep the focus fairly narrow, but let's make sure we get very wide uptake and uplift on that one thing. So if we had, let's say, a half a dozen key things we want people to get really good at in relation to AI, and it might be a certain amount of technical skills, some of the governance stuff and so on, let's just do that and spend a whole year almost doing nothing else, you know, and let's do it across the whole public service. That seems to me to make a lot of good sense. And yet, of course, at the moment, generally speaking, what happens is that individual agencies make their own decisions about what they will and won't spend and where they will and won't focus. And one of the questions that came up, interestingly, in one of the panels that I chaired yesterday was a concern from within the audience about an increasing disparity between different rates of evolution within the public service. So some agencies racing ahead, some falling behind, some still working out which way's up, you know, can't find the keys, never mind start the car, all that kind of nonsense. So everything thrown in, and the the worry people were articulating, got quite a lively conversation actually, is that all that's going to do is simply actually make things worse to some extent, because it means that our rate of uplift will be incredibly inconsistent. And there's one thing that does seem to me to be a powerful driver increasingly in my conversations around public sector reform more generally, is this constant desire. You keep seeing it in different ways in different jurisdictions across Australia, New Zealand, and across other parts of the world that I watch anyway, which is broadly speaking, I guess, the English speaking world. This real desire to try and get a more sort of unified, consistent, one public service approach to these issues, instead of this slightly higgledy-piggledy, you know, everyone does their own thing. So it all makes terribly good sense. And as I speak the words, I think, you know, how could anyone disagree with anything I've just said? The only problem, of course, is that we've got about 150 years worth of cultural incentives that go in exactly the opposite direction. Individual ministers, individual departments, you know, I'm going to do what's right for what I think. I'm not going to, you know, yes, a little bit of beg, borrowing and stealing, a little bit of collaboration and all that good stuff. But by and large, Defence will look after itself, and Centrelink will look up. Well, all the different agencies will look after themselves. So I think we've got a bit of a challenge here, that we have reached a stage where the requirement for skill uplift, if we're still on that topic, which I think is a very important one, might require some pretty deep rethinking about how we do our learning and training inside government, because I'm not
100%.
sure it's up to the mark.
It's totally not up to the mark.
I don't mean technically. I don't mean the standards. I just mean the approach.
No.
I don't think it's going to cut the cake for us. Yeah.
The way we do learning is wrong.
Yeah.
Because for this kind of thing, because it's all about sort of long learning programs, and actually we need to be doing more continuous learning, continuous development, rather than these kind of formal programs of learning, which, I mean, there's value in formal programs. I don't want to take anything away from that. I come from a background of this territory. I'd be insane, it's shooting myself in the face if I said that was no value in these things. However, but when it comes to this kind of skills development, it is so different. We need to actually make it more, little bits of stuff that's done all the time.
All the time.
So the way we actually do the learning has to shift.
And
Agreed.
you can literally,
sorry, go on, Gavin.
You can literally ask AI how to learn AI, right? So you can get feedback from the platform itself.
Not always good at that, though.
True.
Can I just share a funny little anecdote? This will amuse you, but it's a slight sidebar. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
Talking about AI fixing its own problems. I read a piece the other day about the growing incidence of fake pop music, basically AI written pop songs that are now going to the top of the charts and all that stuff. Anyway, and it now turns out that actually quite a lot of music that's trending on various, not just Spotify, but certainly some of the other competitors is completely fake. It's just made, So what they've done apparently on one of these, I think it was a platform called Deezer. Does that sound right to you? I think I might have just made that up. Deezer. Anyway, I think you can find it. It's in the US. It's not available in Australia. Anyway, what they've done to counter this problem is that they've trained an AI platform to recognize the pattern of fake pop songs.
Oh, yeah.
And therefore, because apparently you can, if you're very smart, you can tell, as opposed to just listening to it and having fun while you're making coffee. So the AI is actually fixing the problem that the AI caused, which of course technology has always done, right? Technology, fixes, gives us something we can now do, becomes a problem, and then the technology can say, we can help you solve that. I quite like that. Sorry, that was a slight sidebar.
There's an interesting sidebar to your sidebar, which is that under US law, anything that has any content that has been developed using AI, technically there's no copyright that is attributable to that work.
No.
So therefore, it is not only is it sort of fake stuff, but actually there is no ownership of it.
Totally.
So it's effectively public lit domain, although not really public domain. And now with this new case, this new test case, really, talking about intellectual property and Anthropic, we now have a situation where all of the IP that was used to train Anthropic, Claude,
I saw that.
Is now considered to be a transformational change to the original IP, and therefore owes nothing. Although, interesting enough, Anthropic itself could still be liable for ingestion of all of the the various millions of
books and so on.
Papers or books or music or content.
Yep.
Yeah.
We've got some interesting questions coming through, folks. I just might throw one of these up onto screen from Daintree Peters. So how can government compete with consumer services that have zero guardrails? So we're used to not having that sort of guardrails around us. What happens when we start to engage with government services that have those guardrails?
That's a great question. It's a great question. But my first response is that I don't think this is a competitive problem. I don't think it's about saying to government, we need you to compete in that sense. But I do believe though that the question is putting finger, and thank you for it too. I think it's a good one, putting a spotlight on a particular challenge, which is that at the moment, the pace, if you like, and the standards are being set outside government, no question about that. And then the question is, does government keep up? Does it come up with its own particular versions and so on? So I think it's not so much a competitive, and perhaps in the more traditional sense, but it is a deep challenge, I think, to governments about how they are going to engage and absorb what I keep calling, this rather ugly word that comes up in these conversations, affordances. In other words, there are things now that it is now possible to do, that governments have to keep asking the question, and therefore, should we do it?
Mm-hmm.
And should we do it the same way? And I think the answer is each of those new affordances, those new capabilities, needs to be carefully weighed about, should we do it? Should we do it fast, slow, differently, with guardrails, and so on and so forth? What's the sequence of all of that governance and risk and leadership stuff and skills that need to be put in place? But I think this dilemma for government is that the pace, the expectations, the assumptions are all being forged out in the private sector, broadly speaking, in the consumer world. And this has been true, hasn't it, for the internet for a long time, for 20, 25 years. And then government has said, oh gosh, we're not keeping up with what banks are doing or airlines are doing, or what the way Apple runs its, we should be doing that. And the answer is, sort of yes, and maybe not quite. But you do have to make a conscious decision. Are you going to go down those paths, and if so, how?
In the meantime, though, you've got people like Dario Amode from Anthropic saying that 50% of all entry-level jobs are going to be gone in the next 5 years. Here's an idea with all of and there is going to be a bloodbath, because the reality is, and I'm not against this, right? There's going to be a bloodbath of jobs that go as the result of AI. They're already happening. They're reported widely. So if that's going to be the case, there's going to be a lot of people out of work soon. For government, they should be concerned about that. So here's an idea. Why don't we get all those people to start thinking about how to build guardrails, adequate guardrails? Yeah. Actually get people who are literally on the front line, the canaries in the mine, all of those people who are losing work to AI because of the fact that their job is easily automatable. Maybe they're the best people to actually be engaged in this kind of process, build the right kind of environment to ensure that these technologies are used well. I mean, I heard an example this morning from one of my various podcasts that I listen to, because I listen to them all the time, from a company called Hippocratic AI, which is perhaps not surprisingly is in the medical
name.
Medical
good
space.
name, exactly.
Medical space. And they are offering incentives to nurses and doctors and everybody who's on the front line in the healthcare sector to share their stories of how they diagnose and treat things in an emergency centre, for instance. As a mechanism to teach the system how to better respond to these kinds of scenarios. And those people are going to get a payment for whenever that technology is used. That sounds great for that purpose, for that person.
It does.
And the reality is, in the healthcare sector, is that the very word triaging is because there's not enough people to look after you, right? So,
Precisely. That's the whole point.
So this is actually trying to help with that sector. However, the issue, of course, is that once you get past that first generation of people who were teaching the applications, there's nobody else who's going to be trained in the same role.
No, you've got to do that. It just occurs to me, by the way, the Hippocratic Oath is a great guardrail, right? First, do no harm.
Yeah.
It's not a bad guardrail, right? Because at the moment, it does seem to me, and this came up again, as you won't be surprised. There's a few comments I've noticed on the comments too, about the issues of risk and anxiety, if you like, and some of the legitimate, I think, and appropriate fears inside government. This idea that this is a phase of the technology revolution that does appear to have garnered an unusual level of recklessness and carelessness. There does seem to me to be a strangely, perhaps it's not so strange. I don't know. I've been following it. I mean, you guys are much deeper in it than I am, but I've been certainly following it on and off since about 2001 and a bit before. But this time around, somehow we do seem to be in the grip of a willingness to accept risk and reckless kind of evolution of these technologies. You know, even to the point, as you know, in the US now, post the Trump administration, suggesting that in the end, you know, the trade-off between innovation and safety is to be basically solved by just focusing on innovation, and to hell with safety. Is not quite, but very close.
No,
and that
close,
does seem to me to be not a good thing. That does seem to me to be one. This phase of the digital revolution does feel different to me, to the extent I can make that kind of comparison.
I think there's definitely something in that idea of this cultural shift which has happened at the same time as the technology has become available. That and you know, I'm getting really off topic now, but you know, even down to what's been happening in the last few weeks in terms of the global conflict, you know, the attention to the rule of law, all of these kinds of, you know, aspects of our society which we considered, that our democracy, our participation, our engagement, all the things, our media, our you know, fourth estate, all of these kinds of tools that we've used have and been proud of as
our foundations,
as society, are being challenged. They're foundations, and they're being challenged. So it's kind of, we've got to the stage where you know, there is a recklessness, and I think it may be just because of the fact that these things have been feeding each other, been eating each other, that we're getting to the stage that we are now, that people are just sort of saying, we don't care, let's do it anyway.
It's interesting. We've seen lots of fast-moving technology in the past, right? And we've seen successful projects, and we've seen unsuccessful projects. What do you think that we can? What's some of the best things that we can take forward with us as we start to try and tackle some of this?
Of society?
Yeah. I'm thinking more in terms of the technology we're seeing, either maybe in the public sector. But you know, even internationally, where we've seen things that worked really well, and we haven't applied them yet. They kind of haven't caught up. It could be standards, it could be governance, it could be any range of things.
Yeah, I mean, the standards issue is interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, when you talk to people like Ian Opperman and various other people, the standards world is definitely trying to get its head around all of this. I gather you know, so I think the figure I heard yesterday from Bill Simpson-Young from Gradient, who was talking at the conference at one point, was suggesting there's something like 35 standards. You probably know better than I do. 35 standards now from ISO, you know, the standards authority, and another 40 in the, you know, in the pipeline and so on. So yeah, that's a bit of a catch-up game, and that's an important catch-up game. I think the governance piece was hammered a lot in the last few days, and I think to some extent there are some kinds of rules of thumb. Bill himself had some interesting frameworks. There are plenty out there now where people have got a reasonably good handle on what are the core elements that you need to pull together in a really good governance framework in the AI space. And it does include things like data and data governance and data provenance and so on, but it also includes skills and leadership and decision making and guardrails and all those other good things. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there are elements perhaps where the sort of catch-up game is happening. But certainly, if you take the longer historical view, people will often remind you that if you go back to the Industrial Revolution itself, back in the mid-19th century, it raced ahead in all sorts of ways, right? Railways, electricity, factories, all the rest of it. And, you know, poor old government and the public sector and the rule of law and all those other great things actually were sort of left stranded for a long time again, and had to make it up and catch up with legislation and all that. And, you know, maybe we won't send 8-year-old boys up the chimney. You know, maybe let's not do that anymore. But not to start with, we sent boys up the chimney, right? And so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So to some extent, this is a dynamic that's been with us for a fairly long time, as technology has raced ahead, and then the public realm has said, oh, shit, or maybe not, oh, shit, but you know what I mean? Has said, should we be doing something about, I think we should be doing something about that. Because in the end, this actually came up in a really interesting session yesterday in the afternoon of the conference towards the end, that there's a particular role for government to remind people that not only does it have to be an exemplary user of many of these new tools and affordances, and I noticed Craig Tomlin's joined us, and Craig knows this story better than many, but it also, of course, is the shaper and framer of the environment within which all this happens. It's the rule maker as well as a rule taker. That's kind of fun and difficult and a bit awkward, but it's also a reminder that for folks inside government and inside the public service, these are conversations that have to recognize the very, very unique, if that's the right way of putting it. I know you can only be unique, but bear with me. The particular role that the public sector plays in all of these conversations, because it has to be concerned about the extent to which, broadly speaking, public purpose is the frame for private interest. That's always been the role of government when it's worked well, and it's one of the things that keeps our democracy strong. So that's another dimension for public service leadership and for public service, and actually for the politicians in the broad public realm, that I think we can't forget and need always to factor into this conversation.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I had something similar just before we came on, another conversation, and we were discussing the idea that government has these multiple hats that it wears. So not only is it framing up, it's also putting in place the legislation, but it's procuring, it's buying, it's investing in. And some of these are all balls in the air that are not just free floating; they're actually connected as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for a start, the whole procurement process is really difficult when it comes to literally to AI technologies, because it is not. It's a different business model. The tools keep changing. So there's talk of some of the commentators that I've been listening to have been talking about the idea about AI curation. So you're procuring tools consistently in accordance with the purpose or the need that is required. But it's not like a subscription service. It's not like a piece of architecture or hardware, because you're dealing with tokens, and then tokens have impacts. So you then have to consider about what's the energy considerations of what you're using. Are you using an inference engine? Are you using a large language model? Or are you using any kind of model that is actually using more energy? Does the cost of what you are generating in terms of increased productivity match the improvement that you're getting? So does the cost outweigh, or does it match, or is it appropriate? So all of this kind of procurement, all of these kinds of questions, we need to develop expertise around these things, and that is not something, and there are a whole series of other jobs at the moment that need to be fostered and developed, and as not just in government but in society, I think generally speaking, whether it's education, healthcare, whether it's actually participation in community development, we need to be thinking about how to actually think differently, and it's so dramatic, it's changing everything. Gavin doesn't like the fact that I've been talking about taste masters. He just says it's just a creative director. So there are also these new roles in terms of people who can look at the outputs of AI and actually say, this is good and this is not. And at the moment, the people who are embedded inside of AI tend to have been trained in, shall we say, the real world. People who have actually learned, people who have actually developed mastery of their sphere. And therefore, they have a capability to detect, they have a good palate, shall we say, for intellectual input. They've got taste. The question is, how are we going to sustain that expertise around taste in any subject matter?
You don't have the apprenticeship on the way through.
That's it. Yeah. Because if you don't have the apprentices coming up, if you don't have the entry-level people coming up through the system and learning that expertise and developing those critical thinking skills, those creative, that taste, then you don't necessarily have people that can actually develop that into those kinds of roles down the track either.
And you develop that by doing it. Yeah, no, interesting. That's an interesting dilemma, I think.
Exactly that. Yeah.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and look over at the idea around frameworks and principles. I know that we were sort of touching on that there before, and I've got a list which I can actually I'll pop into the chat channel later, but it's a nice list of some of the frameworks and policy guides that we've captured across Australia, and it's starting to emerge now, which is great. But in terms of that, how which of these are we seeing being picked up, Martin? Do you see these being picked up in general, or are we lagging in that front as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma. I'm sort of a little torn at the moment. There's part of me that is slightly worried that we're almost overburdened with guardrails. Like it's like, blimey, another set, mandatory, not mandatory, principles. There's just lots. There's lots and lots and lots of them, even just in Australia. And the Digital Transformation Authority or agency were at the conference on day one and gave a good sort of 40-minute exposition and several slides, which just had all of these things sort of loaded up on a single slide. There's a kind of interesting phenomenon. I'm not sure that we're at here, that in other contexts, sometimes we're slightly at risk of, every time we see a problem, we dream up another set of guardrails or another set of principles, and then basically we have about 10 of these things or 12 of these things to wade through, and it gets to the point where we don't get anything done because we can't get through all the guardrails. In a different context, a good friend and colleague who does a lot of work in the child protection space, just to give an analogy outside of this current focus, has come up with a very nice sort of metaphor in that space, which is a stairway with a handrail. And his argument is that we've now built so many handrails up that stairway that it's almost impossible to do the child protection job properly, because you don't actually know which set of freaking, I almost said the wrong word there, but I'm not the US president, which sort of handrails you're supposed to grab hold of. Like we've literally overburdened the staircase. It also partly plays, because it's a very topical reference, so I thought I should throw it in, to the abundance story, right? The sort of Ezra Klein stuff, which says, hey, wait a minute, people. We cannot get out of our own way at the moment because we've given ourselves so many goddamn hurdles, particularly we being, in his case, was sort of those coming from a more progressive point of view. And I'm sure you've all been reading that apparently everyone in the cabinet room is now reading Abundance, and it's going to be the book of the month and the book of the year at the Productivity Roundtable, apparently. But my point is, it's the same kind of point. Coming back to your question, I think there is no shortage of principles. I am slightly skeptical about the extent to which people are literally getting up in the morning and saying, I'm doing AI work, I better go and read the principles first before I do anything else.
Totally not.
I don't think that's happening. I'm not following Craig at the moment on the chat, but I suspect we've got a bit of a problem there, that we load ourselves up with these always unexceptionable statements of goodness. But the extent to which the world appears to just rumble on anyway, and sort of a bit like a sort of the tank, just sort of rolls right over the top of them. I don't know. I'm a little torn as to quite how well they are being, what's the word I'm looking for? Mobilized, if I can say.
Observed. So this is what's interesting about the announcement from the UAE in the course of the last couple of weeks. I mean, the UAE decided to actually appoint an AI minister, an actual AI presence in government in April. And then in the last couple of weeks, they're talking about making it a requirement for each cabinet or division within government to use the AI system to check. So effectively, it's kind of like a standards checker. Are the decisions we're making in accordance with the standards that are required? And instead of having an expert standards person come and do it, instead it is literally the assistant or the advisor to all of these cabinet committees that is actually doing that kind of role. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should be all following UAE on everything that we do, but what's interesting about that is, if you're not getting people, to come back to your point about, are people really reading the frameworks and are people actually really observing them? If you actually have a system where there is a requirement to utilize, to at least check and then having someone behind that. So you've got it's like people standing behind each other, right? So you've got people making decisions with an AI engine behind that, and perhaps a person behind that, and something else behind that, and something else behind that. It's about accountability, and Gavin made the point earlier that that we're effectively putting the R back into the racy. Who is responsible for this kind of process, and we need to actually make sure that is that sort of process is followed up the whole, up all the turtles.
Up the chain, yes, all the way up, all the way down. That's right. I mean, I think the other observation I would make is that this is another challenge, I think, for public sector process and leadership, and that is the extent to which, having gathered all these principles around us, this sort of constellation, some might even say a blizzard, but this kind of great big gaggle of, we don't spend a lot of time actually going back and checking whether A, they're being adhered to, and B, to what extent, like what happened as a result of that. So a comment was made in one of the question sessions on the day one of this conference, that we've kind of reached the stage where most of these principles will have some phraseology or some framing around humans and human in the loop, and there's got to be a human. And the answer often is in an agent, yep, there's a human in the loop, it's Fred or it's this position, and they were definitely in the mix. Whether or not that process actually resulted in somebody either not doing something or being stopped doing something is often not actually checked, because the outcome is we have a human in the loop, whereas the outcome should be, to what extent did the human in the loop element of your process end up with a better decision? And we don't spend our time worrying too much about that, because it takes a bit more effort and a bit more time to ask that question and find out what the answer is. It's much easier to say, no, we have a human in the loop. It's Gavin, he's in the loop. It went to him. And you feel like saying, but what happened?
Signed off on
it. Yeah. And then as we've been discussing separately, even if the human is Gavin and Gavin's in the loop, it's Gavin and he's fabulous, but it's just one viewer and one perspective.
So we put the entire problem on Gavin's shoulders. That's
onto one person.
Let's hope he doesn't break.
Story of my life.
And he's not necessarily diverse, shall we say? So not necessarily representative of the community at large. So this is the dilemma that we're going to have to face. I like the idea that.
Let me throw a quick story in, because you've really picked. It's a great story, and it's in the public domain, so I can share it. And it picks up Craig's point that he's just raised here about melding chief data officer and AI. So one of the speakers at the conference yesterday was a woman called Jenny Humphries, who's the CDO, chief data officer at the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, DEWA. Who actually was part of ANSOG's program, Public Leadership for the Digital Age, which I'd quite like to say a few words about towards the end, because it's one of the ways in which I think we've got to get our heads around what we do to help our leaders get into the right headspace for this, but we'll come back to that later maybe. Anyway, it turns out that not only is she the CDO, but Craig may know this, but perhaps that's why he put that comment in the chat. She's also just been designated as DEWA's AI responsible officer. So she does meld those two. And in fact, what they've now done is they are slightly experimentally beginning to put together elements of an AI governance framework, including, for example, and I'm going to come to Joe's point just a moment ago, that there is quite a rigorous, sort of along the lines of the New South Wales assurance framework, but there's quite a rigorous framework of questions that you have to be able to answer in order to get an AI project up in DEWA. People are quite willing to take experiments, and they understand some of them are not going to be successful, but you've still got to go through what they do is that as she was explaining it yesterday, and it really struck a chord with me, is that although she chairs that review committee process, each time they have a round, and I think they do it at least once a quarter, and I imagine they're going to have to think a little bit about how often they have to do it. Anyway, each time they have a round, they switch out one set of reviewers for another set.
Right. Interesting.
So they quite deliberately try to pick up,
diversity.
everything, gender, neurodiversity, First Nations. So they're constantly looking for ways to make the review process itself constantly refreshing, even though she is the sort of linchpin. I thought that
Mm.
had elements of something quite powerful in it. As she look, it was a conference presentation. You know what that's like. You get this much of the view. So I
Yeah.
hope I'm not verbling her, because I think Dewar, I'm a great fan of Dewar. I know their team quite well at the top, and it's a pretty progressive outfit. And they're trying very hard, I think, to get their heads around this stuff. And this was their particular response. So I thought that was fascinating and well worth exploring and perhaps learning from.
Very
Also
cool.
kind of reflective of the standard kind of agile framework, which is the servant leadership model. So you actually have,
nice.
the servant leader, the leader who is actually facilitating the others to participate, kind of like that. I kind of like that.
And apparently this process, the innovation process, has been set up with a sort of headline assumption sanctioned by the senior executive and the secretary, who's pretty impressive, Nat James, that says we know that people who go through this process there's a possibility they're going to fail. Like, we start from that assumption.
Right.
Now, as far as possible, we'd quite like to avoid that too much.
That's right.
But we kind of start from that assumption. Now, that strikes me as being, it may only be words at the moment. Although, as I say, I know some of those senior leaders. I don't think it's just words. And I thought, wow, okay, well, that's not a bad place to start. And then, of course, you construct a process trying not to make it too onerous, that recognizes you can't just sort of say, well, go for your life and try not to break anything. You try and work hard to make sure you put in place some appropriate guardrails. I don't know. I like the way that story was emerging in an agency that I think is quite rightly saying we've got to get our heads across this stuff and make it work for us, and we better find a way of wrangling it. And I think good luck. My sense would be, and I asked her whether this is happening, there's quite a lively AI community of practice across leadership in the APS. I gather you probably know about more, something called Gov AI, which is apparently, again, Craig and others on this call might know much more about it than I do. So there does seem to be some attempt to take this sector-wide view. Coming back to a comment I raved on about earlier, because I think in this sort of digital transformation phase we're in now, I think there's an extra premium on trying to get a sector-wide institutional response, as opposed to the pieces of the puzzle that individual agencies, quite rightly, will have to go and wrangle for themselves. But I think the idea of somehow allowing 1,000 flowers to bloom or not bloom, and then you get this terrible disparity, I think that's a terribly bad place to be if that's where we end up. So I'm hoping that the evidence I'm picking up, it's scanty, but it's good, seems to be that we're going to try and avoid that.
We have had a bit of a dress rehearsal with this, with social media, sort of 2010s, right? And Craig's just mentioned this as well. Pop this up. It does really feel like we know what we're doing this time around. We've learnt from social media, and we've got some better ideas.
It's a great analogy. It's a very good observation, and he and others on this call would know only too well that there are those perhaps who would argue that some of the ways we handle that were not all that optimal, in the sense that we tended somewhat to veer towards we got this social media stuff and you're not going to use this shit, so that's the rule. Next, now I'm just being unfair, a little bit flippant, but he's quite right. We have been down this path before a little, and we've learned a few things, I think, about how you try and get yourself towards this sort of sweet spot, right? That's kind of permissive but safe. We know that these are not trade-offs. They've both got to be in the mix. Where is that safe spot? And I think the social media stuff, some might argue, perhaps didn't always find a particularly good sweet spot, I imagine.
The blind optimism with which we all embraced these new technologies. So tell us about
Heads
ANZOG.
up. Yes, tell us about that.
I will.
We have to a few minutes, Martin.
Let me be very quick, because I think all of this leads to a very big set of questions about how we prepare, develop, and keep supporting our leaders. Because at the end of the day, so many of these factors are dependent on the kind of space that leaders can create and hold for people to get to grips with the issues we've just spent an hour talking about. So I think places like ANZOG, universities, are absolutely, it's a really good app. I really want to pick that up about the New South Wales Liberal Party. Well done them, very progressive. But no, I think there's a very serious challenge for places who train leaders. So we are doing a lot of work at ANZOG, and I'm certainly doing a lot of work at the moment at both the deputy secretary level and then this new program we've developed called Public Leadership for the Digital Age, or in the Digital Age, PLDA. And if you Google PLDA ANZOG, you'll go straight to the page. We're running the second of the programs. We ran a prototype last year. We're doing another one in August and September, kind of aiming for DepSec, FAS, and maybe one level low, assistant secretary, sort of a couple of levels below the secretary. And it's an attempt to say to leaders, what's the frame of reference we need to help you build for you to be able to find yourself a confident space to handle the dilemmas we've just been discussing? Because if we don't help them build that frame of reference, a few things will happen. They'll run away. They'll try and get somebody else to do the work for them. Could be a consultant, or it could just be someone else in the organization, or they'll just panic and they'll freeze. So what's the frame? That's the nature of the program. So I think all of these conversations have big questions to pose to those people who are in the business of helping to grow and support our leadership cadre, existing and new, emerging. That's a big part of the story. ANSOG's trying to get its head across that. The Leadership Academy in APS, there's a lot of people trying to do it, but the ANSOG piece is certainly something I'm putting a fair bit of my time into at the moment.
Sounds great. Sounds like fun, right, Joe?
It's a very good.
Sounds like fun to me. I like the idea of it.
Yeah, well, you be careful. You might be on it next time we do it. I'm always on the search for talent, so watch out. And we also try and rely a lot on people from within the public service. So it's partly external, but actually it's mostly from within, and it's a very peer-to-peer kind of learning. So if anyone's interested and you're in that space, go to the ANSOG website, and there's still room to fit a few folks in before we get going at the end of early August and early September.
Great. Final thoughts, folks. So we're down to the last few minutes, and we had plenty more to discuss. So I think this is a you can certainly keep talking about for many, many hours. But just in terms of this topic today, final thoughts, Joe. What are you thinking?
I mean, I've just coincidentally, like middle of last year, I started walking 5 kilometers a day every day in order to be able to, be healthy. And I started listening to podcasts during my 1 hour walk every day. And so I've been doing this now for effectively a year, and every single week I've been hearing more and more about how terrifying this new world order is going to be, but also how many new opportunities are coming downstream. I think we need to go into this world with positivity, a certain degree of positivity about the our capacity as humans to solve the problems that we're going to be seeing. I believe that some of that problem-solving capability might be augmented by these technologies as well, but I do believe that that we actually have the capability to address these challenges positively rather than see it as a barrier to progress.
Yeah, I like that. Quick thoughts from me, very quickly, just some words really. They did a exercise at day one of this conference, about 70 public servants in the room. How are you feeling about this topic right now before we even start? And the two words that came out biggest on the word cloud was curious and thoughtful.
Good.
And I thought, not a bad attitude to take. So that's the first thing. And then the three big words that for me kept resonating the whole time: we have to have new conversations about risk. We have to have new conversations about learning, both the speed of it and the quality of it. And we have to have new conversations about the nature of public leadership. I'm absolutely convinced that's a linchpin. So risk, learning, and leadership, those are the places where I think we're going to have to make quite a bit of progress quite rapidly in the next year or two.
Risk, learning, and leadership. Love it. Fantastic. Thanks, Martin, for your time, and thanks, Joanne, for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Fun conversation.
Thanks also to our guests online and the great questions, some of which we were able to tackle, some of which will stay in the chat channel there and we can respond online. But we might do this again, and we'll probably like to invite some of our folks that are in the comments there to come along and join us on the panel. That would be fantastic. In the meantime, Disruptors Co, we're here at disruptorsco.com, and we specialize in strategy, innovation, facilitation, go-to-market execution, and performance. And we're all about helping organizations transform bold ideas into sustainable growth. So if you've got any questions or any help that you need out there, be sure to drop us a line. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.
All the best, everybody. Thanks indeed. See you later.